I'm bored. Let's read a book. Oh!
Justin reined in his pony. I did the same, but Gerlach decided he didn't want to stop, at least not there. First, I had to lean all the way back, using all my weight on the hackamore, wishing for the moment that mountain ponies used real bridles with bits, if only to get Gerlach's attention. Then he stopped, all 4 feet instantly frozen. Only the stirrups kept me anywhere near the saddle. That and the fact that the stubby saddle horn had somehow grabbed my belt and almost eliminated any future offspring. Spitting out horsehair, I disengaged my face from the now immobile pony's mane. Justin managed not to laugh. In fact, he didn't even grin, just sighed. Once I was generally back in position on Gerlach, the Grey Magician inclined his head toward the left. At one time there had been crossroads, but the posts showing the town that lay down near the narrow pass, to the left that had been split by weather and with the part of the name missing. The arrow still pointed through the gap in the brush, with the notation 5K remaining on the bottom on the squarish pillar. To the left is the old town of Fairhaven. I usually take my apprentices there. But since you aren't an apprentice, why? Because it gives most of them a unique perspective. Those few who totally failed to understand never became masters. No matter where I went, I couldn't get away with it. More veiled messages. Do what you want, but I shrugged. Fairhaven, if you don't mind then. It will add a half a day or more to the trip. Doesn't matter to me. But if you feel we have to get somewhere quickly, you said Weave-It is another day. There's like 2 days and more hills between us and Jellicoe. It's worth the detour in more ways than one. Justin didn't seem to make a gesture, but Rosefoot began walking the trail toward Fairhaven. Unlike most of the roads I had traveled in Kandar, except for Wizard's Road leaving Freetown, the path through ungrown near the edges and far narrower than the twisting main thoroughfare was straight. I swished the reins, but Gerlach didn't budge. Flamed stubborn pony! Just as I was ready to jab both boots into his flanks, he ambled forward after Rosefoot and Justin, as if he intended to do so all along. The path seemed scarcely more than an overgrown trail. If that, straight it was. Though I scarcely qualified as a tracker, I looked for traces of earlier travelers without leaning too far over in the saddle. In the dried mud, perhaps half a K from the fork, I saw a series of widely spaced deer prints. Neither hoof prints, wheel ruts, nor boot prints. At one time, the road had obviously been much wider, wide enough for 4 wagons abreast, in the regular line of trees behind the low bushes. Undergrowth signified the old road boundaries. The trees were white oaks, their branches bare in the cold. In places, leafless creepers now crossed the track, positioned to assault the road in the spring. In less than a handful of years, the brushwood reclaimed the trail entirely. Justin, does anybody still live in Fairhaven? I'm not certain. The last time I was here, there were still a few inhabitants. Wasn't it once an important place? Very important. You can see how straight the road is. As we approached the top of the gentle grade, the trees seemed taller, and the wind picked up, with a hint of another storm. Looking back over my shoulder toward Hewlett, the not-so-snug inn where I had met Justin, I studied the overhanging gray clouds. But they looked no different than they had the morning amongst the featureless gray of winter, without the darkness that usually signified approaching snow. I sniffed at the wind, sensing a bitter odor like ashes or slag, which blew from the direction of Fairhaven. Had the once prosperous town caught fire? Straining in the saddle, I looked forward as the trail crested. Nothing. The road continued straight ahead, straight down a gentle grade into a wide and shallow valley, dotted with small hills and scattered trees. I looked again, then at Justin, whose eyes looked straight ahead, seeing nothing, or perhaps something I could not see myself. Without realizing it, I shivered, not from the cold, but from something else. The taller trees seemed to form a pattern, although I could not discern exactly what it was. All of the taller ones seemed to be deciduous, and only a scattering of shrubby jumper brush showed green against the browns and blacks of winter. Closer at hand, about a quarter day ahead on each side of the trail, were two large hillocks, or heaps of white clay, or... Justin, was this the whole valley of Fairhaven? As a matter of fact, it was. Some recollection from somewhere tickled my thoughts, but as I strained to remember, whatever it was disappeared. Those were the North Guard towers. I pointed to the white heaps ahead. No, Fairhaven didn't need guard towers. Those were the gates. They were always open. By now I could see the so-called gates. Under a light covering of dirt, the hillocks were a dead, pure white. Nothing grew on them, nothing. As we rode closer, I realized why. Something had melted the stone, melted it like sugar candy at a carnival. My eyes flickered to the melted gates to Justin, who was sitting on Rosefoot with his eyes closed, concentrating as his pony picked her way past the old towers. The odor of old slag and ashes was stronger, almost overpowering, and a cloud of unseen darkness loomed ahead. Everything looked normal for a winter's day in Kandar, gray and brown, cold and sere, with northern wind at my back, except for the dead whiteness of the melted gates. For some reason, I put my hand on my staff, the one that marked me as a different, whether I willed it to or not. The black steel bands at the top were warm to my touch, even through the gloves. Laris? Justin's voice was low. There may be trouble ahead. Do exactly as I say. What? Do what I say. Do not leave the road. Hold your staff, but do not unlash it, no matter what. His eyes were still closed, his features expressionless. At first, the sound recalled the wind, but the breeze had disappeared once we had passed the gates. Overhead, the sky was darker somehow, although the clouds looked the same as before, and it was not quite even midday. The odor of dead fires and slag was stronger now, but there was still no sign of anything that had burned, not any time recently. The leafless bushes by the roadside somehow twisted, and the few leaves hanging from the autumn before were all white. So were the branches themselves, a near shining white, although I had never seen a bush with slick white bark. Even the bark of the birches was off-white and rough. I clutched the staff with my left hand, gripping the reins even tighter in my right. Garlock plodded down the gentle grade. Ahead, the road flattened and widened. Under the dust and mud, I could see traces of stone paving blocks. Behind the bushes were now roofless buildings, only a story high. This was the old town center, made of solid stone, granite in some cases. I glanced back from Justin, who rode with his eyes closed, to the ruins beside the road. The roofless buildings were more intact than the gates, except for the debris piled around and against them. Several looked as though a new roof and some interior work would have made them habitable. Ahead is the newer town center, where the council held court. How anything in ruins could be called new was beyond me, and I was getting nervous just about the howling sound. Justin seemed to ignore it as he talked and rode, his eyes still closed. Justin had to be looking at something. Something. He was a wizard. Antonin had said he was, and he had a number of apprentices who had become masters, or so he had indicated. The sound was closer, on the other side of the newer town center. My left hand still on my staff, warmer to the touch even through the leather of my gloves. I tried to study the ruins, even as Garlock and Rosefoot picked their way toward the howling. The stone melted that had destroyed the city gates had struck even more of the wildly around the newer square. The ruined buildings were twisted as if they had been hot white wax flung through a whirlwind and then stomped flat by a giant foot. This was built by the Magicians' Council, the old square by the Stonecutters' Guild. Justin did not open his eyes, but for the first time his voice sounded strained. I shook my head. Why bother with descriptions? The place was clearly dangerous. By now the smell of ashes made every breath almost burn. Don't look at them, just look straight ahead. Recognition leads to fear, and fear increases their power. What power? Whose power? The Howler's power. I chucked the staff, ready to pull it free, if necessary. Don't! I tried to relax my grip on the dark wood, forcing myself to look straight ahead. From the corner of my left eye, I could see a shape flicker, trying to grab my attention. I glanced down at Gerlach's mane, and the whitish shape disappeared. With each generation, they're weaker, and with each person who passes successfully, their powers are diminished. Justin's voice was faint but clear. The road began to slope upward as we continued southward. I started, looking straight ahead at the suddenness of the sound. On the trail, standing on a liquid white paving stone, was a twisted and turned figure, white and streaked with red but shining. I blinked, trying to look down, but the figure seemed different, more human, almost as if it was wearing a wet red and white robe, and the twisted white was more like a reverse shadow cast behind him. Mine! The robed figure seemed to spring from the pavement, which spread to resemble a wide avenue, along which tall oaks rustled in the wind. Mine! As the second voice echoed in my thoughts, I found the staff in my hand up before my face. The figure hit the staves as if to rip it from my hands, which were bare against the wood. The input rocked me in the stirrups, jolted me back into the saddle, and it was gone. I was half coughing, half retching, surrounded by the foulest odor I had ever smelled. A cross between rotten fish, wet ashes, and brimstone. The mist burned my eyes, and I could see nothing except a tan blur that was Gerlock's mane. Managing somehow to empty my stomach without losing the staff or my balance, I had teetered in the saddle, finally standing up. Justin had said nothing, but I could tell both ponies were moving forward, still on the old trail. By the time I could see and breathe, I could also see why Justin had said nothing. He lay spread over Rosefoot's neck, somehow in the saddle, but very still. At the same time, the feeling of white oppression, more sullen than darkness itself, was gone, although the gray clouds seemed lower than before and darker. The darkness was that of an approaching storm. Swishing the reins, I tried to get Gerlock to move closer to Rosefoot. Grudgingly, the pony obliged. As I drew abreast of the other pony, I could see that Justin was breathing. His arms were thrust into sheaths on the other side of Rosefoot's neck. Mind throwing? Had the wizard sent his thoughts elsewhere? the sheath's consciousness, and he was still breathing. Still, I rode next to him, hands on the still staff, feeling the warm wood against my hands. Something about that bothered me, but I wasn't about to sort that out until we were out of the valley. Well out. The Council of Magicians. Fairhaven, something in my studies. Something that Magister Kerwin had said had to do with this place. That sound hadn't been a real sound at all, only a sound in my mind. The howler hadn't been able to make a real sound until I recognized him. I let my thoughts settle, took another look at Justin, who was still breathing, and I wondered what I should do. Rosefoot kept stepping forward, and so did Gerlach, so I waited, wondering whether the magician's thoughts had gone. The cry had more of a feel of a mental whimper, as if it, whatever had cried, were about to die forever. How something that was dead could lie was beyond me, but that was the way it sounded. Both ponies kept picking their way up the long, gradual trail, still heading straight south, until we passed through another set of melted stone gates. The south set contained dark streaks, embedded in the dead white, as though they had been burned rather than melted. The odor died down, and I finally put the staff back into its straps. Justin still lay sprawled across Rosefoot, still breathing, and the ponies kept walking. Then I realized something. The palms and the insides of the fingers of my gloves, except for just the fingertips, had burned away. But there were no burns anywhere on my hands, nor were there any other burns on my clothes. Just a line of charred leather, outlining the missing sections of gloves. It was a wonder they had stayed on so long. I peeled them off, folded them, and tucked them into my belt. The afternoon began to grow darker as I glanced overhead, but the clouds were still about the same. The wind was picking up, the way it had often did in the late winter afternoons. Justin started to shake his head, then stopped as if in pain, as he slightly righted himself. "Laris?" He looked back over his shoulder without finishing the sentence for a time. "That should be the end of Friven." That's what they called it at the end. This time I did shudder would be more like it. Fairhaven, Friven. The second name should have been more familiar than the first. City of Chaos Council, brought down in a hail of fire more than 2 centuries earlier. I shuddered again. You saw Fairhaven, before it became the Chaos Master's city? Justin, still looking back, nodded absently. I was younger then. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on any of these videos. See y'all in the next one. Goodbye!